So next, let's build a NavBar. We can incorporate some more of the Bootstrap-like elements to help solve some of these common metaphors like navigation. We'll start here in the layout, and if you remember, we have this menu class here. This is just a list of links, essentially, that we've styled in a certain way. But I'd like it to be a little bit more friendly, and that's where nav type. I'm going to replace the menu type with just a nav type. And this is going to give us the ability to show these as something that's a little bit easier to click on with the mouse and even with touch if you're using it on a mobile device. Let's see what that looks like, just changing the class to nav. Now these are sections that are nice and big, and we can click anywhere on here. That doesn't have to be right on the name like it did a minute ago, and it's more fitting with everything else we're trying to do. So now they are still just links, because of course we haven't changed any of the LIs or the anchors in here. We're still using all the tag helpers to build them and all this. It's just this class nav that is telling it to style the unordered list in this very friendly way to the user. As you start looking at this, you probably will start seeing, oh, I know the 4,000 different websites I use that are probably already using Bootstrap, because I'm starting to recognize some of these metaphors in use. Another common metaphor is an actual, what they call a nav bar. This is a bar that includes navigation elements and can even have things like buttons and such. And we'll incorporate our button here for showing and hiding the menu into a nav bar on top of our main section. The first thing we'll want to do is to add a class to both the main and the footer element inside of our main wrapper. Now remember that this sidebar is fixed to the left-hand side, and you can certainly do some different things with Bootstrap to change that, but we're going to ignore that and just assume that this is going to be the main part of our website, this wrapper down here. And what we'll do is we'll add a class to each of these called container fluid. Now there are two actual containers. There's that Bootstrap supports, and this plain old container is fixed size towards sort of the middle of the page to try to give a fixed size experience for lots of websites. But for apps, I found that using container fluid, which says take as much of the web page as possible, and then as we do grids later, it'll fit within one of these containers. And so no matter what size screen you're on, it'll try to give you appropriate widths for how big the browser is. And we'll do the same thing here for footer. Because of the nature of our website, not a whole lot's going to look different, except you'll see that we got a little padding on the left, and that's by design. It knows that this is going to be towards the edge of the page, both sides, but of course there's no text over here. And so it's giving us some standard padding on the left-hand side to give us room between these two. And now we can start to build a nav bar here at the top. And we're going to do this by actually creating another element above the main section and even above the footer, of course. It's going to be called a nav section. This is a type of HTML5 element that tells browsers and such this is where navigation is going to be contained in. And it's going to have NavBar, as a class, as well as, for us, NavBar default. And that's just the styling for NavBar. There's also an inverse. In fact, for us, let's go ahead and use inverse. And within this NavBar, we can have different sections. So as a container for what's inside here, let's go ahead and create a div with the class of container fluid. And then we can create an unordered list here to contain the different elements. And for us, there's actually only going to be one element, and we can sort of borrow it by grabbing that button down here. I'm going to get rid of this div in the main, so that this sidebar toggle, we've moved it, but it's not actually going to be changed in many ways. We're just going to say contain it here in our navbar. And so now in the browser, we can see that navbar button here, but we also have this dot here. Why the dot? That's because we haven't styled that unordered list yet. And this is where understanding and in some ways looking and studying the different ways of setting up these nav bars would do you some good. A lot of times I'll have to go back to the Bootstrap website to look at an example to really understand. This is actually one place where Bootstrap 4 will start to simplify some of the nav bar, because it does require knowledge of exactly how all these things come together. And the first time out of the box, it seems a little confusing. But this unordered list starts with a nav as a class, and then a navbar nav. And these set it up as a container for a number of items that are going to sit inside the actual navbar, which is that block that goes from left to right. You can have a number of these. We're actually going to just show you 3 of them. And then we want to tell it where we want this on the list. So we can say nav bar left. What that does is left justify whatever is inside of our project here. If we show this now, we can see we now have this on the left hand side. We're also going to show you something that is just after this, and then we're going to show you some buttons on the right hand side so that you can see the ability to do each. Here we're just going to create a plain old anchor, and we'll put inside of it the title of our website so that every page is going to show this. Right now we have it sort of in the content of our main page, but we'd like there to be some sort of link that will take us back to the home page everywhere, especially if the menu is not being shown. Now we can put an href here, but instead let's use those tag helpers. And so this should build us just a link back to the home page. And if we go ahead and add a class here, we'll tell it what to do with this. And there's actually a NavBar brand class that says this is for that big piece of text that represents sort of the branding of the website. Let's see what this looks like. We can now see the world directly to the left of our buttons here. And so let's go ahead and create a section on the bottom that represents everything right justified. And I'm going to show you how to create a couple of things that look like a toolbar button. And so we'll create another unordered list, and we'll class it just like we did up here. In fact, I'll copy these. But the big difference between them is that instead of left is that we're going to tell it to right justify them. And let's go ahead and create a link. And we're just going to use a simple link, but for our destination of our link, we're just going to say this page, which is what the pound represents, because we don't actually want them to do anything right now. We might wire up events to them later, that sort of thing. We won't actually do that in the course. These are more to just show you, though. But we're going to use as a class the button class. And the reason we're using the button class is that this can change the way a link looks and represent it as a button. And I'll make this a small button, and let's go ahead and make it info. And for the contents, let's say this is going to be a save button, and we'll go ahead and use that font icon I element again to do that. So FA to say it's a font icon, and then FA, and there's probably a save. Yeah, save. Let's create another one, because the idea of putting this in an unordered list is it's actually going to show these left to right, but we can represent them as a list of items, even though we're telling Bootstrap to display them in a certain way. In this case, I'll say print, and there's an FA for print as well. And if we refresh the page, we can see we now have these buttons on the right-hand side, just like we thought we would. So now we have a look and feel for the top of our page that kind of gives us that experience. We now have a working button on the left. We have a link over to our home page here in the middle. And then we have these save and print buttons that don't currently do anything. But if we had some more of these buttons, or we wanted to represent them as just icons, we could get quite a few here before we started running into space issues. And finally, let's fix up this awful looking footer we have here. We want to get it to the bottom of the page like we had it before, and we want it to just look better. So we'll use some of the same techniques here. We're going to leave this as the container fluid, but here I'm going to change this to an H4 instead of a paragraph tag, and that'll represent kind of making it a little beefier, a little larger. And I'm also going to use text center to force this to be centered on the page. Refreshing it, ooh, that looks a little better, but it's still at the bottom of the content. We really want it to be fixed to the bottom of the page, and we can use the navbar to do that as well. We do that by just wrapping this in another div, and this extra div is where we're going to set as the navbar item, again using classes. So navbar, navbar inverse, so we have the same look as the top bar, and navbar fixed bottom, we'll push it to the bottom of the page. So we've got it showing on the bottom of the page, but we're actually missing the text. Wonder where it went. It might be off the page. In fact, it's there, but it's the same color as the bottom of the page. So let's just, here in the layout, let's instead of saying primary, Let's change that to info. Let's see what this looks like in the browser. Better. It's a little muted, but that's fine with me. Gets the look and feel of what we want. So now we're starting to get some of the aesthetic sense of what Bootstrap is actually giving us. And so we're able to get a sense, at least from the layout, of some of the structure we're getting. Let's apply some of that same structure to our actual page here. And we're going to do that by understanding the grid system. Let's talk about that next.